très heureux de voir qu'on était si nombreux à être présents aujourd'hui. Honnêtement, on n'avait pas forcément mis des chiffres aussi grands. Donc ça fait plaisir de voir qu'autant de monde se déplace pour cette thématique. Et donc, on va parler aujourd'hui d'anonymisation de données. Donc, je vais parler et paraphraser un petit peu ce que dit la CAI, parce que je sais qu'il y a plein d'avocats et de juristes dans l'Assemblée, et n'étant ni l'un ni l'autre, je veux m'assurer de ne pas dire de bêtises. Donc, on va parler de la loi 25 sur la protection des renseignements personnels, et en particulier leur conservation et leur anonymisation. Donc, selon la Commission d'accès à l'information, la CAI, un renseignement personnel est anonymisé quand il est en tout temps raisonnable de prévoir, dans les circonstances, qu'il ne permet plus, de façon irréversible, d'identifier directement ou indirectement cette personne. Donc, comme on va le voir aujourd'hui, l'aspect irréversible est vraiment très important et crée beaucoup de défis et d'enjeux. Et autant pour les organismes publics que les entreprises, l'anonymisation des renseignements personnels constituera ainsi une alternative à leur destruction. Donc, c'est cette alternative que nous allons regarder aujourd'hui et tous les enjeux que ça lève. Donc, le symposium est organisé autour de deux grands axes. La première partie traitera des enjeux techniques d'anonymisation. C'est le panel numéro 1 que vous avez ici, avec la première présentation qui sera en ligne et en anglais. Et la deuxième abordera leur enjeu juridique. Donc, je tiens en particulier à remercier donc, la chaire LRWilson pour l'organisation du symposium. Donc, merci Lydie et Henri en particulier, et l'Observatoire international sur les impacts sociétaux de l'IA, donc l'OBIA en plus court, pour son soutien, ainsi que le Centre de recherche en droit public, le GERAD et la Fondation du Barreau du Québec. So, welcome, Professor Khalel El Eman. Donc, docteur Khalel El Eman est titulaire de la chaire de recherche du Canada, niveau 1, en IA médicale. Il est également chercheur principal à l'Institut de recherche du Centre hospitalier pour enfants de l'Est de l'Ontario et directeur du laboratoire multidisciplinaire d'information sur la santé électronique, menant des recherches sur les technologies d'amélioration de la confidentialité pour permettre le partage de données de santé à des fins secondaires, y compris la génération de données synthétiques et les méthodes d'identification. Donc, il va aujourd'hui introduire les enjeux techniques d'anonymisation. So, thank you, Professor Khalel El Eman, to be here today, and you will have the floor for 30 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning. Can you hear me?
Wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll just
But just
share
to
my.
say,
I am sharing the wrong screen, so let me do this. One moment. Okay.
yeah, that's perfect now. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much for the invitation to present today. What I wanted to cover, I think the topic that may be a useful introduction to the conference is talk a little bit about the definition of anonymity and data anonymity, and describe some of the practices that have worked well over the last, say, decade and a half or so. So I'll start off with some just very basic principles, which I think are very important to establish. And if you've been working in this area for a long time, you may already know this, but I think they're still important to repeat and emphasize. So the first thing to note is that the identifiability falls on a spectrum, and it's although it's described as a binary concept in many statutes, it is a continuous concept with At one end, there's identifiable data here, which is when data can easily be linked to a real person, such as when you have their name and address in the data set. And then at the other end, you have non-identifiable data. And if you think of this as a probability, then essentially you have a probability of 1 at one end, and in theory, a probability of 0 at the other end. Although the probability of 0 of identifying a person in a data set is not really realistic, because there's always a non-zero probability of re-identifying a person. So on this spectrum, you have this concept of a threshold here, which splits it into personal and non-personal information. And threshold is a number, it's a probability basically, and I don't believe this is controversial. We as a society have been sharing data for many decades, and there are some pretty well-established thresholds for what's acceptable, what's an acceptable risk, what's an acceptable probability for data to be considered non-personal. These precedents come from national statistical agencies. The area that I work in health data, European Medicines Agency has established some thresholds for anonymization. Health Canada has established some thresholds for anonymization. And as we shall see later, the new international standard, the ISO standard 27559, also provides some thresholds which have been developed and that are consistent with the Ontario guidance on de-identification as well. So once we have a threshold, then we can establish that data is identifiable, not identifiable, and there are many methods that have been developed to measure the risk. So if you're able to measure the risk along the spectrum, then you can determine whether you're above or below the threshold. And risk measurement or estimation of this probability of re-identification has been a topic of research for at least 50 years. There's a large body of work on doing that. There are many estimators for estimating that risk. Some are accurate, some are not accurate, some are easy to calculate, some are not easy, some are computationally intensive, some are simple. But there's a large body of work to draw from for determining how to measure this this probability of identification, right? This risk score or re-identification score. So that's one principle that's just important to establish. The other principle is that re-identification risk, we'll think of it as risk because it's really a risk management exercise. This risk is consists of two components: data risk and what I shall call context risk. So data risk is what folks typically think about in terms of how easy it is to re-identify a data set or re-identify information. So that's kind of the more common way of thinking about anonymity. But equally important is context risk, which are the security, privacy, and contractual controls that exist at the organization or the entity that's processing that data. So the more security controls, the more privacy controls, the stronger the contractual controls, then the lower your context risk. And there are checklists that have been developed to measure those things. So this is not difficult to assess as well. And then motives and capacity also look at whether the entity that's processing the data has the motives and capacity to re-identify. So, for example, do they have other data sets that they can link with the data set that we're talking about, the data set in question, to enable them to re-identify it. But the risk then is measured by a combination of data risk and context risk. So you can have a data set that has been anonymized, let's say, and then you add to it some additional controls to reduce the risk further, to manage the residual risk. But you always consider these two components together, right? And there are models for evaluating the risk of both of these components together. So it's not just about the data risk. If you have a public data set, then you have no context risk because you have no controls you can put in place. So public data is different. And this is also why it's really important to make a distinction between public and non-public data when you're talking about anonymity. The way you think about anonymity, the way you think about re-identification is different between public and non-public data. And the main difference is this context risk doesn't exist for public data, but it's really important for non-public data, because for non-public data, you can impose additional controls to manage risk. Whereas for public data, you cannot impose controls, so you have to manage all the risk by modifying the data. Okay, so that's the second principle. Excuse me. So now let's talk about how do you evaluate risk, taking into account all of these components. So there are many standards that have been developed over the years to manage and assess re-identification risk. And here's some examples from different countries around the world. I'll just highlight a number of interesting ones. As I mentioned before, Ontario published a de-identification guidance for structured data, which I think is a very good document. And it won a number of awards as well. Singapore published a recent basic anonymization guidance, which again I think is very pragmatic. The Singapore Privacy Commissioner, Personal Data Protection Commission has been very pragmatic and has developed some good guidance in general over time. The European Medicines Agency has published guidance on the anonymization of health data of clinical reports as part of their Policy 70, and Health Canada has followed with their own guidance, again, for clinical reports and clinical trial information. And then recently, there's this international ISO standard 27559, which reflects a lot of good practices. So there's a lot of guidance. And it's important to note that the ISO standard is actually a Canadian standard, because the ISO standard document was originally a draft guidance document from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada that eventually they decided not to release. It went through multiple iterations of consultation and public review. And then they decided at the end not to release it, and they submitted it as a contribution to ISO. And then it made its way through the ISO process, and it ended up being ISO 27559. But it was initially this OPC document. So this is actually something that was developed in Canada as a guidance document here. So it's a very good document. It's a very good standard. But anyway, the point is there are many standards for anonymization. This is not a mystery. There's a lot of documentation, a lot of methods, very practical methods that one can use, very well documented for implementing anonymization, following the two principles that I mentioned before. Okay, so I'll just dig a little bit deeper, and then I'll talk about definitions. So we usually divide data sets into three types of variables: direct identifiers, quasi-identifiers, and sensitive variables. Direct identifiers here are things like name and address and telephone number. Quasi-identifiers are things like demographics, location, and dates. And then everything else is sensitive data. So when we transform direct identifiers, we create pseudonymous data, right? So pseudonymous data is data that has been where the direct identifiers only have been pseudonymized. Remember, there's direct identifiers, quasi-identifiers, sensitive variables. So if you modify the direct identifiers only by encrypting them or removing them, you have pseudonymous data. Pseudonymous data is always considered as personal information. And the reason is that you can easily re-identify data sets if they have only been pseudonymized. Pseudonymization is very important to do. So it's necessary, but it's insufficient. And therefore, on the spectrum, you'll see that pseudonymized data will always have a risk above the threshold. It's better than not pseudonymizing, of course, because by pseudonymization, you move the risk closer to the threshold, but it won't cross the threshold. Or very rarely, I mean, you could come up with some specific examples where pseudonymized data will cross the threshold, but that's not likely to happen in many situations. And the reason pseudonymized data is still personal information is because you still have the quasi-identifiers here. And most re-identification attacks, successful re-identification attacks, have been conducted on pseudonymized data on the quasi-identifiers. Not all of them, but most of them have been conducted on the quasi-identifiers. Some re-identification attacks were done on data that had direct identifiers, but we'll ignore those because they're not really serious attempts. But most publicized re-identification attacks were done on pseudonymized data. And so we know that when you only have pseudonymized data and the quasi-identifiers are intact, then it's not impossible, actually, it's relatively straightforward in many cases to re-identify the data sets. If you then deal with the quasi-identifiers by suppressing them, by generalizing them, by adding noise, then you can move your data to the other side of the threshold, and you end up having non-personal data or anonymized data. And keep in mind, this threshold is not zero. This is really important to note, in that the idea of zero risk or zero threshold, or the idea of impossibility or irreversibility, which implies zero, is not a standard that can be met in practice. The threshold is always going to be above zero. The question is, what is an acceptable threshold? What is a threshold that will give us adequate protection in a practical way? So it's not zero, it's always above zero. And then when you deal with the quasi-identifiers, then your data set moves across the threshold and becomes non-personal information. So here are the thresholds from the ISO standard for public and non-public data. And these are consistent with thresholds that have been published in other documents and by other organizations, but I think referring to the ISO standard is always helpful. And so for the public data, we typically use maximum risk. It's one way of measuring risk. Maximum risk is quite conservative, also known as K-anonymity, but essentially it really is a very conservative way of assessing risk, and it's typically used for protecting and assessing risks in public data releases. And for non-public data releases, we evaluate average risk, which is not as conservative. Because with non-public data, you have all the controls as well, so the layer of controls. So you have a less conservative measure of risk, and it allows you to have higher data utility, because the higher risk, the more you modify the data. You have to modify the data, and the more transformations and lower the quality of the data you get at the end. So that way you can get higher quality data with non-public data, because you also have all these additional controls in place. So we have thresholds. They're standardized by the ISO standard in this case. Okay, so I've described to you the process. Now, what I also wanted to mention or cover is well, now we know how to do all of this, but a lot of the statutes and regulations that are coming out today do not reflect that body of experience. So an exercise we went through last year was to say, well, if we had to develop an ideal definition of identifiability and anonymity, what should it look like? What do we need to cover? And so I'm pulling in parts of definitions from different regulations and different statutes in the US and Canada to hopefully present to you what I would say is the ideal definition of anonymity, because it reflects best practices that exist today. So the first component which comes from the US HIPAA, is that you just have a privacy rule that there's no reasonable basis to believe that the information can be used to identify an individual. So that's the basic definition, right? So that's the first item here, number one. An important part here is the reasonableness standard that's being applied. So we are using a reasonableness argument to say it's not plausible, it's not hypothetical. We're looking at reasonableness as a criterion. That information can be used to identify an individual, the information that's in the data, for you to be able to claim that it's anonymous. The second important criterion is that whoever is doing the anonymization must have appropriate knowledge and expertise. And I'm here using the identification and anonymization interchangeably because the US HIPAA uses the identification and other statutes use anonymization. So I'm using them interchangeably here, which I know is very confusing and I apologize. But if you bear with me, I think the points will come across. So, whoever is performing the anonymization must have appropriate knowledge and expertise, which means that you can't make stuff up. You have to have someone who has some knowledge and expertise of the topic to be able to perform the anonymization. And over time, I mean, this has been around for 20 years, almost 20 years. Some good practices and good habits have developed around defining what is appropriate knowledge and expertise. So the training courses, their degrees, people who've done research on the topic are considered to have appropriate knowledge and expertise. But you have to demonstrate that you have that. Basically, there's a bar that has to be met to say that you're competent to perform this type of anonymization or to perform anonymization. Okay. And then you have to follow generally accepted scientific and statistical principles. Again, this is important because if anyone has been following the C27 hearings in Parliament, it looks like the generally accepted best practices has been taken out of definition in the privacy component of C27. So, which I think does not help. But nevertheless, HIPAA has that definition, generally accepted scientific and statistical principles. And again, it basically means that you have to use any of the guidelines or standards that I showed you before. You follow the ISO standard. That's arguably a very good example of generally accepted scientific and statistical principles. But there's a large body of work as well. Many guideline documents from regulators, from very credible organizations, from health regulators in the case of health data, and so on. So I think this is really important, this requirement, because it forces you to have to look at existing best practice. And best practices evolve over time as the risk environment changes over time. Best practices evolve, and therefore it's important to remain abreast of these changes. And best practices, of course, will evolve, so you need to be following them to be able to claim that you're still implementing these generally accepted practices. And then you have to ensure that the risk is very small. It doesn't say the risk is zero. It says the risk is very small. And as I showed you before, there are well-established thresholds and probability thresholds for acceptable risk. But also means you have to measure it, because how are you going to claim it's very small if you're not able to measure it? And you have to have some sense of, thresholds to be able to say, well, that's what very small means. So there's a lot of things embedded within this risk is very small. And this also comes from HIPAA. And then that the information alone or in combination with other reasonably available information would not identify a person. So here we're looking at reasonably available information. So this is information that an adversary is likely to know, not information that is hypothetically knowable, but reasonably available. So information that, again, the reasonableness standards is being applied here in terms of what an adversary would know to launch a re-identification attack on a data set. Another important requirement, again from HIPAA, is the anticipated recipient. So you're always measuring the risk from the perspective of the anticipated recipient, not from the perspective of the data controller. Again, this is important to emphasize because some regulators around the world some DPAs have made the point that the risk should be evaluated from the perspective of the controller or any third party, which is a standard that is very difficult to meet. So if not impossible to meet, actually. So you always assess the risk of the anticipated recipient. And this is consistent with some recent rulings from European courts, CJEU, for example, that essentially makes the point that you consider the risk from the recipient's perspective. What information can a recipient get lawfully or would have access to? Very important requirement here, given some of the statements that have been made by various regulators around the world. And then you have to document the methods and results. So all of these are 7 points, very reasonable points, reflect really good practices, have been around for multiple decades. They work well in practice from the HIPAA privacy rule expert determination method. Okay. Reasonably foreseeable in the circumstances is language in the Quebec law. And I think this is important, and I believe this wording has made it in C27, in definition of anonymization in C27. So from an interoperability perspective, that's a plus. This essentially opens the door to consider the context, because you have to look at the circumstances within which the data is being processed to evaluate the risk, which arguably can then include all the controls that I mentioned earlier on. Another important requirement, this is from PHIPAA, Ontario Health Privacy Law, is that anonymization or identification is a permitted use, which means no additional consent is needed for the act of anonymization or de-identification. In many statutes and regulations, this is read into it, but I think PHIPAA is helpful by making it explicit that it's a permitted use and therefore does not require additional authorization or consent to perform the act of anonymization. I just used the UK example here, but there are other statutes that make it an offense for a person to knowingly or recklessly re-identify information. So essentially making it with some exceptions, but make it an offense essentially to re-identify. Again, and I think an important point to include in any definition of anonymity in any statute. Current practice here, so we're number 11, is that the risk assessments to claim that a data set is anonymized is typically time limited. Again, I'm talking about what happens in practice. We typically set it to 24 to 36 months, the typical range. Some people do it fast, shorter, some people do it longer, but that's the typical range. What that means is data set is not claimed to be anonymized forever. It has a time limit that says it's only for that period, because we know the world will change, and after that period you have to reassess the assumptions to determine whether the assumptions are valid, and if they're valid, then you have to perform the risk assessment one more time, repeat it. And then this is an FTC requirement, but essentially what it's saying is that you should, because the risk is a function of the data and the context, you should pass on all the obligations to any other third party that you share the data with. So the data and the context have to travel together. Every time you disclose the data to someone else, you have to impose the same controls. So you have to contractually prohibit re-identification as you pass the data on, but you can also read into it that contractually you need to pass on all the other conditions that are imposed on the initial data recipient to any additional or subsequent data recipient from the data set. So that would be the ideal definition of anonymity. It lists all the critical requirements to make clear how to assess risk, what you need to take into account when you're assessing risk without being too prescriptive, but just the basic things to ensure that you have strong guardrails, and that really leverages what we have learned over the last couple of decades of doing this in practice. Thank you. If folks have any questions for me.
Thank you, Professor El Eman. We have time, I think, for 1 or 2 questions.